The number one selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, out of botulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
I might refuse to answer them, but you can have a go.
They're not silly ones. They're good ones.
Oh, that's what's worrying. In my new life, the silly ones are easy.
Welcome to the Power Test. I'm Ayesha Hazarika.
And I'm Sam Freedman. So on this week's episode, we have one of our competitors coming to join us, Ed Balls, who has his own podcast with George Osborne. So I guess the first question is, which one of us is Ed Balls and which one of us is George Osborne?
I reckon I'm totally Ed Balls in this. You're definitely George Osborne because, like, you're really, really clever. And Balls is very clever as well, but George has a sort of cool forensic strategic intelligence to him, which you do. I think I'm more like Ed Balls because I'm just like a giant show off, basically. We've both got that kind of quality about us. We're sort of like overexcited toddlers just seeking attention all the time, and we'll kind of do ridiculous things to get attention.
So I obviously don't particularly want to be George Osborne in this scenario because he's not the most loved of characters across Britain. But the sad thing is we did have exactly the same educational path. We went to the same school and the same college.
Did you?
So if we have similarities, it's probably not that surprising.
How many times have you been booed at the Olympics?
I have never been booed at the Olympics. I do get booed sometimes when I do events and I'm introduced to someone who used to work for Michael Gove. That usually gets a boo. So I then have to immediately come on and say, don't worry, I don't work for him anymore. Please.
You're like, listen, I'm super left wing now. I'm practically like a Marxist now.
I'm more left wing than these Labour baronesses, you know. So it's...
Well, do you have any of the wealth that George Osborne has?
Sadly, not. No, I do have as many jobs as him, I think, but I don't. None of them are as well paid as the ones he does. So, and I think that the thing that we're really going to try and get him to talk a bit about today, apart from what he makes of George Osborne, is some of the work he's been doing, more academic work he's been doing on regional divides, because this is such a massive issue for the new government coming in, new Labour government coming in. The fact that after a lot of huffling about levelling up and, you know, many years of talking about regeneration and so on, we've never had stronger regional divides between London and the southeast and the rest of the country. Someone described it to me the other day as sort of Singapore surrounded by Portugal. And the sort of question of how do you boost productivity in areas outside London is critical for growth, but also how you give areas outside of London more sense of place, more sense of ownership of their politics. We've seen the rise of mayoral authorities and so on. So it's really thorny issues for the new government.
I completely agree. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation, but I feel really anxious about this agenda for a couple of reasons. I think the absolute box office slogan, levelling up, you know, was so good at the beginning and everyone was like, yes, I completely understand what this means, because regional development policy doesn't exactly sound very sexy. And I think what Boris Johnson did, he's very good at the slogans. Everyone's like, yes, I completely understand levelling up. This is a thoroughly good thing. Who could be against this? Everyone should be for it. And because it has been such a spectacular disaster, it has been so hollow in terms of going from a slogan to any sort of substance. And then you have these terrible situation with councils, many councils on the brink of going bust, you know, terrible stories about places like Birmingham City Council. And for all these reasons, it feels like the north-south divide, as you say, has never been more entrenched. And I think the great sadness about this agenda. It's essential, but I think people are really cynical about it, and understandably so, because no government has really managed to deliver on it. And I did see that the Labour Party was trying to do its own version of levelling up. I was sort of hearing that instead of levelling up, a new phrase, powering up, may come in. But I don't think people are going to buy these slogans because people really feel like this has gone nowhere.
And I think, the very idea that it would be done by a Westminster government is a big part of the problem. Like, it shouldn't be them levelling up other bits of the country or powering up. God, that's a terrible name. I really hope they don't call anything the powering up department.
I'd like a department that says, have you tried switching it on and off again?
On and off again. But no, I think there is a sense that stop trying to do things to us and let us get on with it. And there was a poll out the other day that showed Andy Burnham's now the most popular politician in the country, despite only operating in one part of the country, in Manchester. I thought that was really revealing, that he's been able to, from a regional base, has been able to create a very, very substantial local profile. He'll saunter to another win in the mayoral election there, but also a national profile off the back of it. And I think that's showing the way for a lot of other areas who've maybe been a bit sceptical about going down the same path. They're thinking we want a bit of that. And you've got local politicians thinking we want a bit of that as well.
Right. Well, we have spoken to Ed Balls about all of these issues around regional policy and much, much more. Let's have a listen. And now I'm delighted to introduce our first guest of our new season of the Power Test. And we have an absolute cracking guest for you. We're delighted to welcome Ed Balls, a man who needs very little introduction. Of course, former Shadow Chancellor, former Labour Cabinet Minister, former Senior Labour Advisor, and now star of the small screen. Good Morning Britain, national treasure via Strictly Come Dancing, often seen doing Gangnam Style at various weddings. Ed, welcome to the show.
And podcaster.
Oh, sorry.
You can't miss that. Like, it is such a relief for me to sit and chat with you and not have to talk about George Osborne's multiple jobs or his, various career or personal foibles or whatever. It's I
did want to ask you about that. Just to, as every week some new bit of the public sector collapses, don't you just want to sit there and say, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so?
I think though these things are all about style and about having the way you have the argument. And I think the thing about podcasting, as you'll know, is that we're talking to people who are choosing to listen. They may be out walking the dog, they've got their headphones on, or they're in the car, and they don't necessarily want the House of Commons to be replicated within their head. So it is possible, I think, to have a reasonable conversation and to disagree, and in some time disagree quite strongly without it being shouting and hectoring. And one of the things when we started this podcast, George Osborne and I had done election campaigns for 2017-19 for ITV. We're doing the next one. But other than that, we hadn't done a lot of this. People were saying, take him on. And I think I have been doing so, but, with a more subtle, humorous style than we used to do over the dispatch box, when it was a little bit more, who's got the bigger mallet.
I mean, on that, it's really interesting because when you were in politics, and of course, you and he were such rivals. I mean, you were a very pugnacious politician as an advisor and as a frontline. And, we worked together. And our side, I mean, we really did not like George Osborne. We really, on a visceral, cellular level, hated everything that he was doing. All these years later, you're a podcaster, but you're also friends. I've become friends with George Osborne. He hired me at the Evening Standard. We were at George Osborne's wedding together. When you look back at yourself in politics, did you ever imagine that you could become friends with this man who's your arch enemy?
No, of course not. I mean, it's ridiculous. I just sort of think in life, it's a good thing to be able to disagree with people quite strongly and even morally without having to hate them to the essence of their being. And, there are some politicians I really didn't like, but, quite a few of them were on our side rather than on their side. But that isn't the same as, I didn't think that George Osborne, unlike some other very senior politicians, I didn't think he was doing it for the wrong reasons. I just disagreed with what he was doing.
So on an issue where I think there probably is quite a bit of agreement between you, sort of this sort of issue of regions and the fact that a lot of our productivity problem as a country comes from the fact that so much of our success is concentrated in London and South East. Now, that's something that as Chancellor, he pushed the idea of mayoral combined authorities and created the sort of mayoralties in Manchester and in other parts of the country. That's been taken on by the government. It's something that you've gone on to do some work on in the last few years, looking at this sort of issue of devolution. Where do you think we're at now with it? And how much further do you think the next government has to go on this sort of question of boosting regional economies?
You say that we agreed. The first thing that the coalition government in 2010 did was to rip up the entire network of regional development agencies which had been established by John Prescott, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair in 1997, and sort of total scorched earth, start again from scratch in the first instance with what were very weak, small things called local enterprise partnerships, which were a bit useless. And I think it was only really 2013 where George Osborne suddenly realised he had made a mistake. Part of the work we've done is trying to stop politicians only working out this is something which is important later on in their time in office and to focus on it at the beginning. For me, my pedigree goes back to the late 1980s. I wrote my first academic paper in economics with Larry Summers and another US economist called Larry Katz in 1989. It was called Regional Hysteresis and the North-South Divide in the UK. And it was looking at the way in which divides were becoming entrenched again. And so we went back to look at this 3 years ago, me and a team of guys at the Kennedy School. I mean, I actually was taken aback. I hadn't realised until we did this work that the gap between London and the South East and the rest of the UK is now wider than between East and West Germany, wider than between North and South Italy. We've had 100 plus years of regional divide, but the striking thing about the last 20, 30 years is that while in other countries those divides have stayed stable or narrowed slightly, in Britain they've overtly widened. And I think the starting point for me, if you want to turn around the UK growth performance, which is like an imperative now for whoever wins the next election, if you don't understand why the non-London and the South East regions do so poorly, not just compared to London and the South East, but compared to comparable cities in Europe and America, you aren't going to raise the UK growth performance. So this is not about tackling regional inequality for its own sake or simply because you want there to be fairness. It's actually at the centre of the growth imperative for the next government.
And in terms of that commitment and having a long-term focus on this idea of levelling up, pushing power and affluence and growth just outside London and the South East, this is something, Ed, which many governments have talked about. Many thinkers from across politics have made this argument, as you say, for the last sort of 30 odd years. There is the academic thought that this is a really good thing to do, and yet it doesn't happen in reality. You know, as you say, you're seeing these divides get starker and starker. We know local government has had a big hit. We've got many councils on the brink of collapse. Why is it that the reality of policy is just so far removed from the rhetoric of everybody understanding that this is a good thing to do?
After the Brexit referendum, where the cities tended to vote for Remain and the smaller towns tended to vote for Leave, there was a sort of view, in order to tackle this and heal this, we need to level up. And that means in the first incarnation for Boris Johnson, it was really Whitehall giving out small pots of money to towns across the UK. That isn't the challenge which we face. This is not fundamentally about small towns outside the cities. When we went and looked at the data, because the first paper we did was very economicsy, the thing is that it's the cities and their surrounding towns which underperform in the UK outside London and the South East. The cities who voted Remain and the towns who voted Leave around them, Leeds, but Wakefield and Kirklees and Bradford, it's that conglomeration which underperforms. Actually, the divides between our towns and our cities are not stark compared to other European countries. What is stark is that Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds and their surrounding areas perform so poorly. So then you have to kind of dig into that and say, well, what is going on? We know, look, why it happened. You know, in the last 40 years, you had that massive macroeconomic shock in the early 1980s, which hit manufacturing, alongside a big expansion of professional financial services, which London was ahead in. But that doesn't explain why it's persisted and got worse and worse than other countries. And what we looked at in our first paper was why this was. If you do that, you realise that policymakers, Conservative and Labour, have not addressed properly what needs to be done. And it's absolutely not about pots of money handed out from the centre through something called a levelling up fund. You know, we have disproportionately spent kind of money on innovation and ideas in London and the South East. We've disproportionately spent money on transport in London and the South East. What we haven't done is made transport within our cities and their surrounding conurbations and surrounding towns more effective. We have been poor at spending on science, engineering type skills across the UK in general. On skills, we've done well on graduate skills, but not on those particular STEM skills. There are barriers to companies outside London and the South East getting equity finance. There's a whole range of things. So the policy levers have not been pulled, the right ones, in the right way consistently over 40 years. I mean, since 2016, since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, there were myriad different incarnations of levelling up. There wasn't one approach. At the moment, post-Johnson, they're back to supporting mayors and combined authorities and devolving some powers. The opposite was happening during the pandemic and immediately afterwards. And so that instability is so bad.
So what is the next step? Is it about building on the mayoral authorities? Is there something else that needs to happen as well as sort of moving towards more power for those groups? Is there something about devolving more power to local authorities again? What are the sort of key 2-3 things that Rachel Reeves, the next government, need to be thinking about?
It always sounds naive if you are a former politician or a commentator to say we need a consensus. Second paper we did, just short of 100-hour-long interviews, all on the record with policymakers from the last 40 years about what they thought they got wrong, including 3 prime ministers, 6 chancellors, loads of civil servants, loads of local government leaders. They all say we didn't focus on this early enough with sufficient clarity and determination. The prime minister was never properly engaged. We didn't get the allocation of resources right, but we didn't also empower people to get on and do stuff. As I said, it always sounds a bit naive to say we should have a cross-party consensus, because our politics find it very hard to declare cross-party support. But what tends to happen is things which last, they sort of become cross-party without anybody quite saying it. Bank of England independence, voted against by the Conservatives in 1998, ended up being consensual, despite Liz Truss's best efforts. The minimum wage, viciously opposed by the Conservatives in 97, 98. George Osborne boasted about raising it. It became cross-party. That's why it's lasted. And I do think we have at the moment an opportunity, because the combined authorities with elected mayors or equivalent figure is working, has the potential to work better, is, I think, supported in those areas where they exist. The Conservatives, I think they're a good idea, and Labour thinks they're a good idea. And therefore, without having to put up a big sign saying we've got a consensus, I think we might have one.
And when you talk about these elected mayors, they're an interesting new part of the political architecture, and they've become big figures in their own right, as you say, particularly during the pandemic. Andy Burnham, of course, is the name that springs to mind. But I was struck by what you were just saying, speaking to policymakers looking back when they said they didn't empower local people enough. And one of the things that we have heard from mayors, we interviewed Steve Rotherham on our last series, I've interviewed Andy Burnham many times. They say that they would like more powers, particularly around things like being able to raise some local taxes and that type of thing. Whereas it looks like Rachel Reeves and the centre doesn't really want that to happen. I sat on Gordon Brown's Commission into Devolution, and there was an argument, yes, you should give some more power to these mayors, but not too much power, because you still want to kind of keep things quite centrally controlled. What do you think about that kind of tension? How much more power would you give to these elected mayors? Would you give them the power to raise taxes?
We said the elected mayor should have a seat in the House of Lords ex officio while they are being a mayor. I certainly think the Gordon Brown Commission idea of there being a forum which is kind of regular and proper, where the Prime Minister and the leaders from Scotland and Wales and the mayors come together and talk collectively about how we do stuff, would be a really, really good thing. And we'd quite like to have had that during the pandemic. So there is a sort of interesting constitutional question. If you're going to do that, and if you are a new government which says this is key to our growth and prosperity agenda, in my view, you have to break from the voluntarism we've seen in the last few years. If Manchester wants one, let them have the one. West Yorkshire wants one, let them have them. If Leicester doesn't want to be involved in it, fine. Because it's pretty hard to say this is our new kind of settlement. Everybody's part of it. And this is about growth and good jobs, and that should be for all. And then to say, but we're only going to prioritise some parts of the country. So I think it needs to be comprehensive. I think the government should say at the beginning of the Parliament, our plan will be for there to be combined authorities everywhere by the end of the 5 years. And you can take your time to work out how you want to do that locally, but we will make sure it happens everywhere if you don't kind of rise to that plate. And then there's your question, Ayesha, is about tax, where interestingly, in the work we did, our almost 100 interviews, almost nobody wanted to go for big tax devolution. That isn't to say that you can't have some tax raising powers. At the margin, that's a good thing to do. But within England, big tax devolution is a very, very difficult thing to do because, once you start talking about kind of VAT or income tax, over what area are you levying it? What would be the fairness of that? There's good reasons why the Welsh Assembly have never wanted to go down the tax devolution route, because they always worried that would put at risk the sort of fair funding settlement between the UK and Westminster and Wales. So I think there's good reasons to be quite cautious about this.
But isn't the counter argument to that if you don't give them tax raising powers, then essentially all they're going to be doing all the time is coming to the centre and saying, can we have some more money? And then they get some more money, and then they get cheered in their local press for winning some more money from Whitehall. If they don't get money, then they complain that they can't do whatever they wanted to do because they didn't get money. It sort of really reduces the accountability if you're not actually responsible for raising any of the money that you then want to go and spend on projects.
At the moment, our taxes are levied in Parliament, and there's accountability to our Parliament. There isn't a Parliament for the combined authority of Greater Manchester. There isn't a Parliament for in West Yorkshire. The accountability happens through the individual mayor, and it happens through the individual local authorities coming together to cooperate. Once you move into the realm of raising taxes, it's much harder to do that without a counterpart assembly. So I think the consequence is that there are accountability reasons why it's not easy to go for big tax raising powers at the combined authority level, because what you would potentially have to do as a counterpart would be very complex and destabilising. But I think the bigger issue is fairness. The boundary issue between the people in Greater Manchester paying one tax and the people who live outside Greater Manchester and commute in would avoid the tax, but are part of the Greater Manchester economy would be problematic. At the moment, what the Treasury does is it uses its public spending planning to make sure that those areas which can afford to pay more tax and those areas which have greater need receive more money. The moment you start to say, well, let's go for big tax devolution, that starts to put that kind of equalisation certainly more in the spotlight, but potentially more in contention. And that is also challenging. So there are, in a centralised, dense country like ours, with quite a lot of inequality within it, going for big tax devolution is potentially quite destabilising. And I would say you can do a lot without needing to go down that road.
We are international outliers, though, in not having any tax devolution. I mean, we are very unusual in how centralised our tax system is. So it must be possible to move to a system that's at least a bit more localised, because pretty much every other country, even France, is a bit more localised than we are in terms of its tax base.
I'm quite happy to go for a bit more, though. I'm not against a bit more. And I think if you actually talk to Steve Rotherham or Andy Burnham and you look at what they're actually proposing, what they're proposing is, can we have more control over business rates?
Yeah.
Could we be able to raise a particular kind of tax on properties within our area? Could we have a particular kind of tourist tax? Those things are fine. At the margin, more tax devolution is a good thing to do. But to start talking about local income taxes or devolving a chunk of VAT raises your whole big series of accountability and fairness issues, which I think would get in the way of what we want to do.
I just want to move on to another topic, something that Sam and I have discussed quite a lot, and this is the state of local governments as well. And certainly when we have spoken to leaders in local government, they have said to us and expressed an aspiration that if Rachel Reeves becomes Chancellor, that she will borrow a bit more and she will be able to give them some more money to plug the massive funding gaps that there are, but also for things like housing. I mean, we've heard that from a number of local council leaders. What do you think the chances are of that happening, particularly this big crisis that we're seeing in local government? People are really hoping that a future Labour government is going to ride to the rescue on this.
Funding local government properly to play the role it plays in managing place is a really important part of this. And there's certain things which you can do at the combined authority level with the mayor. And they aren't only economic, although planning is a really big part of that, and housing. We say you should move the planning housing decision-making more to the combined authority level. But because the mayors are also in charge of policing, de facto the police commission, that means that they get into public services around the sort of social counterparts to policing. And then we know in the Manchester deal, a role in health as well. But it doesn't stop local government being the core place where local services are delivered and where kind of place is recognised and funding. And you are completely right that if places aren't good places to live, the local transport can be great and you can be building the houses. But if you haven't put in place around that the infrastructure to make living good, that is a challenge to your kind of economic strategy. It wasn't our place in the work we did academically to start telling Rachel Reeves what she needs to do. But of course, we say very clearly, we've underfunded for a long time public investment, local transport. We don't do enough on STEM skills. We need to build more homes. Our planning system needs to be much more effective. And that isn't only about where decisions are made, but how you resource the making of those decisions. There is a chicken and egg challenge here. It's very hard to make our public finances stack up in the next 10 or 15 years without stronger growth. But there's some stuff which is going to have to be done to get growth to be stronger.
What did you make of the May's lecture that Rachel Reeves did last week and the framework that she's starting to set out for what that kind of plan for growth might look like?
I think the first point is if you in opposition can do a May's lecture and get that kind of coverage, including the splash in the Telegraph, you're doing well. She as Shadow Chancellor will think, that was a kind of a great outcome. She definitely got more publicity than George Osborne got for his. I think more than Tony Blair got in 1995 in opposition 2 years out from the general election. I would like to say that she got less publicity than mine, but I never got asked. I don't know what it was. Between 2010 and 2015, no Labour Shadow Chancellor gave the May's lecture. It was a little bit like going to Davos. I don't know. We were frozen out by the Cameron Osborne Clegg grip on the economic and political establishment. The second thing is it's impossible for her to break out of the grip the government has on the baseline. That's just the nature of our politics, and we've all been there. The fiscal framework, though, that she set up makes to me complete sense. It's the one we essentially established in 1997. It's the one which Jeremy Hunt has pretty much returned to now. I think it's very interesting, the discussion about how you have a strategic, security-orientated industrial policy which doesn't become protectionist. And she's very keen to say this is not protectionist. But how you walk that path is hard. If you're America, it's easy because trade is such a small part of your economy and you can afford to be a bit protectionist if you want. And that's the way it's always been. For a small, open global economy like ours, she needs to make sure she doesn't send a signal that her desire to protect strategic investments and assets doesn't become a signal to foreign direct investment that you're less welcome here. I think if it was me and I was saying what was the missing element, back in 97, we had a really kind of strong Schumpeterian creative destruction strand in the way in which we talked about economic policy around, opening markets, opening the ability for entrants to come in, toughening up competition policy. We had the Competition and Markets Act in 2001, criminal penalties for cartelising behaviour, bearing down on companies who are overcharging for goods and services. And I think that a counterpart to the strategic industrial policy side is also to be on the side of the company which is not yet established but wants to come in with a new idea. It's sort of dropped out of the way in which we speak in recent years, and I would put that back in.
Ed, look, there'll be many of our listeners who are really Labour people, but we do also have a lot of listeners who are soft Lib Dems, soft Greens, even soft Conservatives. And sometimes the question that we get about Rachel Reeves and about Labour's economic policy, which is, look, the pursuit of growth is really sensible. Rachel Reeves seems eminently sensible, very, very rich in excellent diagnosis about how things have gone so badly wrong over not just recently, but the decades. But what's the actual prescription for growth? How is a future Labour government actually going to get growth? Because things like, Securenomics, it's a great portmanteau, but, there's lots of things that we're at the mercy at, world events, and you don't just rock up in Downing Street and pull a big lever that says growth. Getting growth takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of luck. It takes everything coming together. What's that answer to that question? Because I think that's something that people are still struggling with.
It's very hard for any opposition to give a sort of full detailed answer to that question at this stage. There will be, and there should be, a central growth drive which has got to involve the Prime Minister. It needs to be about working with business rather than against business, which would be a break from the rhetoric we've seen from Labour and quite a lot of Conservatives in the last 10 or 15 years. I think within that, it needs to be kind of the championing of open markets and consumers as well. I would like comprehensively backing combined authorities with devolution of power at resource and strategic direction in some key areas as part of a UK-wide growth plan.
And just to follow up on that, you mentioned about the importance of a good working relationship with business. Peter Mandelson's just written that he doesn't want Labour to go too far on the workers' rights package that Angela Rayner has been promulgating. Where do you think the balance lies between having this good relationship with business, but of course tending the relationship with the trade union movement, which is really important to Labour as well?
I think saying that you should have a good relationship with business is not saying that you should have a cosy, compliant relationship with business. I don't think they are the same thing at all. The last thing that the Labour can afford to do at the moment is to do what business says or what business wants. On the other hand, if you are an opposition leader who says, I don't care what business thinks because these are the vested interests, the enemies, and if they're against it, it must be good. That is also a terrible way to make policy and very undermining of your country as a place to do business. The New Deal for working people, at the moment, it's a set of principles. Who can be against, though? If people are sick, they should get sickness pay. And the idea that you should only get it after you've been working for months and months and months in an environment where you could then be sacked and rehired to avoid it is wrong. On the other hand, there is no business in the public or private sector, no employer who thinks that it is sensible to give people full unfair dismissal of rights on the very first day they're at work, because until you've worked out whether you are right for each other, you have to go through some kind of induction or probationary period. And Labour, I think, has said, I'm not sure if they said this formally, they certainly told the newspapers there'll be a probationary period for unfair dismissal. And that's completely the right thing to do. And if business pops up and says, don't do it, you shrug your shoulders. But if they say, you're doing it, but think about this issue, if you're smart, you listen.
Can I come back to something you said a bit earlier? You talked about sort of the opposition always being sort of in the grip of the baseline, the fact that the government get to set what the 0 point is in terms of public spending and taxation. And for any opposition party, it's always difficult then to veer away from that, because then you're spending money that you don't have or so on, which a government can get away with doing. I think the big question for a lot of people at the moment, certainly when I'm doing sort of events and so on, is at the moment, Rachel Reeves is kind of trapped by the grip of that baseline. She can't say she's going to spend more money. Labour will get attacked. To what extent is she going to have to change that approach after the election? Once she gets to control the baseline, assuming that she wins, how is she going to use that power? Is she going to stick to being extremely hawkish, or is she actually going to make use of the fact that she's now got that power to be a bit more generous to the public sector, given everything that's going on?
There are two aspects to the sort of baseline unfairness. One is that, if Jeremy Hunt says in the run up to the budget, I've got some headroom, has he got 15 or 20 billion of headroom? If you're the Chancellor, you can say, I've got 15 billion of headroom and I'm going to use that to cut national insurance. I mean, what he's doing is he's borrowing to cut national insurance. His headroom is extra borrowing up to the limit set by his fiscal rule. And he's saying, I can now afford to do some more borrowing for tax cuts. But he calls it headroom, and he's allowed to do that because he's the Chancellor. And once he announces the Red Book numbers, they're the Red Book numbers. If Rachel Reeves says, consistent with my fiscal rule, I've got some headroom, and I'm going to use my headroom to do X or Y, that immediately becomes extra borrowing compared to the Red Book line, extra borrowing for tax cuts, irresponsible, or push up interest rates. And that sort of asymmetry, that is kind of unfair, but it's a fact. The second question, though, is what the assumptions are which underpin the numbers in later years. And that is, I think, where we're in a bit more of a mess, because, nobody thinks that Jeremy Hunt's numbers for public spending are deliverable from 2024 onwards. The IFS, Resolution Foundation, no civil servant that I speak to.
No.
The National Health Service, the pressures on defence because of what's happening in the world, what's happening in social care, as you talked about, Ayesha, the massive pressures on local government. The Office of Budget Responsibility have done more to call that out this time round. Jeremy Hunt, who has set out after Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng to be a responsible, sensible Chancellor, is at the moment not saying anything sensible about the path of public spending after 24, 25. And that is very hard for the opposition in that framework.
Ed, look, many people look back at sort of the run up to 1997, and of course that was a very different financial climate. There is an anxiety amongst people who want to vote Labour that because Labour's boxed in at the moment, because they're being very cautious, Mingvas, etc., there is just a feeling of a lack of excitement about what Labour can offer in terms of economic hope. Everybody understands that it's really difficult. Labour doesn't win elections that often. Labour has to be really, really cautious. But people are also feeling that there's nothing really to kind of quicken the pulse or sort of excite people. And also people are asking the question, when is Labour going to unveil more particularly sort of tax and spend plans, which of course is really difficult to do for them right now. If they go too early, it's going to get ripped apart and the Tories are probably going to steal it. On the other hand, if you leave it too late to kind of pitch roll big ideas, then you run into the short campaign and you don't want to be doing that then. From a sort of strategic point of view, when do you think Labour is going to have to show us what's in the shop?
Well, I think there's a distinction between setting out your vision and setting out the detail of big ideas. I would be surprised if Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer want to set out big, costed, shadow budget style numbers on policy. To the extent they did that over their 28 billion commitment, they've withdrawn from that, I think rightly. To the extent they did that over funding health service investments through changes to non-domicile taxation, that has caused them a challenge now to find the alternative source of revenue to pay for that. And that's something they're going to have to do. So if you're judging this on, is there going to be a longer pre-committed shopping list of costed policy proposals, I think you're going to be disappointed. But that isn't the same as feeling inspired and excited about change. And that is in the end what the leader and the shadow chancellor have to do.
Look, Ed, you can help adjudicate. Sam and I have an ongoing row every week about the election where Sam says it's just completely in the bag for Labour and the Tories are going to be utterly wiped out and that Labour should be much bolder. And I'm much more cautious than Sam, having had the scars on my back. I think Labour is going to win, but I don't think you can take anything for granted. Where do you come down on this?
I've always been cautious like you. You'd have to say it's now likely Keir Starmer is going to be the next Prime Minister. But for Labour to win a good working majority is really hard. That's partly just a fact about Scotland. When we won in 97, when Labour won in 97, we won 56 seats. When Gordon Brown lost in 2010, Labour won 44 seats. Labour's currently got 2. So to get from 2 to 44, which was a losing position, is like really hard. Double, I think, what most people's expectations would have been a year ago, let alone to get up to 56. Now, maybe you're going to see a 2015 style Labour landslide against the SNP rather than the other way around. But that requires a lot of people to make a massive emotional shift. And then more generally, when I lost Morley, I can't remember what the majority was that Andrew Jenkins had, about 350.
Yeah.
Now it's kind of
10,000.
well over 10,000. So it's not easy to turn around majorities on that scale. And it's one thing to have a sort of by-election, which becomes a totemic moment. It's another thing for that to happen on an election night when you're actually making a choice rather than sending a signal. So we'll see. Sam may be right. And it may be that 2019 is a very distorting baseline. But to do better than Tony Blair did in 1997, it feels like really hard for Keir Starmer. But he needs to do that to get a majority of 1, as I understand it. That's right, isn't it?
Yep, that's right.
Well, it depends on proportional and uniform swing, but we won't get into that. For our listeners to tears.
So, okay, what issue would you like Labour to bring up that hasn't been discussed, that's not in the sort of political bloodstream at the moment, something you care about?
I would like Keir Starmer to take back the idea of global Britain from a nonsensical post-Brexit Johnsonian myth and say that actually we are a country which has always wanted to be global in our reach, to work with countries around the world, to participate and kind of lead where we can in global regulatory environments, to be open to talent from around the world. And that starts with having a better trading relationship with our main trading partner, which is the European Union. I actually think that being confident about Britain and its outward facing role in the world, and that not being deregulatory madness or Singapore on Thames or simply thinking a trade deal with India or Sri Lanka is going to turn things around. That's what I would do if I was him.
What one person, dead or alive, would you want to see in the Labour cabinet after the election, if there is one?
Well, I fought my seat in 2015 and lost. The very good thing was in the next door seat to me, and we did lots of things together and did lots of fundraising, and I talked a lot about what Big Elected was all about with Joe Cox. And so I think I'd probably quite like Joe Cox to be in the next Labour cabinet, and that would help us to sort of heal some of the nastiness and pain of the last 10 years.
And final question to you. What's the one big test that you would set for Labour in power to show that they're really ready and capable of changing Britain for the better?
Well, I think it's a good thing to be willing to say when the other side did things that you agree with, that you support them and are going to carry them on. And I think Rachel Reeves does that on the Office of Budget Responsibility. But I actually think some language around continuity, around mayors and combined authorities would be a mature thing to do.
Excellent. Well, Ed, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. We have so enjoyed that, haven't we, Sam?
Yeah, it's been great.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And if you are not a member of the Power Test crew, you can become a Power member. Doesn't that sound incredibly Instagram? I get up at 5 a.m. Here's my morning.
You can be powered up into a Power member.
Powered up into a Power member. You can head to the powertest.co.uk or the powertest.substack.com. You'll get episodes ad-free and early before anyone else. And there's also an exclusive chance to be part of the podcast and lots more. Also, do get involved with us if you've got any questions or comments or ideas you'd like us to explore. We'd love to hear from you. You can email us on pod@thepowertest.co.uk. You can also get involved on social media as well.
And we've also got our brand new YouTube channel, which is Power Test Pod, and you can find clips on there. The Power Test only exists because of the amazing support from you, our members, and our supporters. And we're also delighted to have the backing of some brilliant organisations like the Future Governance Forum, which is providing intellectual and practical infrastructure vital to the revival of progressive government in the UK, and the Centre for Progressive Policy, a think tank championing inclusive economic growth. We're also really glad to have support from the Institute for Global Change, who provide us with exceptional research and briefings, and also partner with the fantastic Labour List, bringing to life many of the issues, themes and discussions we're covering on the pod. And if this episode has got you thinking, from this Sunday you can join the very first of our new Power Test debriefs, a live online chat about everything from this week's pod. The debrief will take place every Sunday at 6 p.m. on Twitter, I'm not calling it X, at The Power Test, and will be hosted by members of the Power Test team and our partners. So make sure you're following, get involved, tell us what you think, and join the conversation. Visit thepowertest.co.uk for more information.